Thank you everyone for joining us. My name is Yehiatzin Yuhat Duasak Kluknahadi Hatsati Kagwantan Yadi Ayachat Shitkakwan. My name is Yehiatzin Nicholas Galanin. I am Luknahadi, a child of the Kagwantan people of Sitka. I'm here with you all today from Sitka, Alaska. It's my home, it's where I'm based, it's where I was raised, and where my Tlingit ancestry and culture has been from time immemorial, really. So I want to share with you a little bit about connection to place and how this informs, you know, so much of what we do, so much of what I do as an artist, and who I am, and how I learn to engage in the world in ways that I believe are useful for our survival, and also just useful for caring for place for future generations. Land shapes us and our cultures if we listen, if we allow it to. I come from a place of abundance and sustenance. We still practice our harvesting, our customary harvesting of and fishing, hunting. These are big, important aspects of health to our community and our culture. Respecting the way these ways leads to a healthy community and environment. This is processing salmon, something we do seasonally. When you live close to the land and you understand how everything's connected, I believe that you're more likely to care for place. There's so much danger and disconnect in our communities. There's so much environmental violence that happens through disconnect to place, and some of these connections are also carried on through lineage, through continuum. This is a photograph of my great-grandfather, George Benson, in the center here. This is a northern style Tlingit canoe model. There's that he had designed for the community. The larger canoe is here in Sitka right now, and is one of several recent canoes that have been created here. This is my father, Kinda Dave Galanin. He's one of my mentors. This is him working on some jewelry. And my uncle, Will Burkhart, who is also a mentor of mine. Of course, my children. So I share this with you I feel like it's really necessary to include the conversation of continuum and culture and general conversations and understanding. Knowing our place is dependent on land and sea, responsibility to function beyond consumption through creation and connection. And this is some of these projects. This is a houseboat I'm currently working on that I, of course, had my children and my cousin Lee Burkhart, who's apprenticing with me for several years now, working alongside me on that project. This is a kutiye, a totem pole raised in Douglas in Juneau, Alaska. I believe this was raised in 2018. It was a healing pole carved to commemorate and mark the site of Tlingit village that was intentionally burnt down in the 60s to make way and remove homes and families for construction of what is now a boat harbor. So these stories of continual displacement are as recent as these generations now. So some of the other work that I've continued to create, jewelry. Again, I mentioned my father is a jeweler, my uncle is. So this is a big part of that continuum, and to me, it's an extension of that wood carving and those other cultural practices. It's an ancient visual language of form. This is a recent copper crown created for Erica Badu, which you might recognize. I want to talk a little bit about the current civil rights movement happening here in America. I would say the largest civil rights movement. This is a photo of Rick Williams taken recently in Seattle. Rick is the brother of John T. Williams, woodcarver, who was murdered by Officer Ian Burke, August 30th, 2010. The woodcarver was shot 4 times in the back as he crossed the street. This photo is from recent anti-police brutality and BLM protests 10 years later. My ears are numb. This work was created for John T. Williams in that story. It's a US flag, the drum, and the drumstick is carved out of red cedar and is a reference to John T. Williams crossing the street in Seattle with his carving knife and his totem pole that his small totem pole he was working on at the time of his murder. God Complex. This work is a ceramic riot gear. It reflects the fragility and fear of the police state. The position references the attempt at making martyrs out of those who damage our communities and murder Black and brown youth by politicians and media. The title refers to the pathological belief that police exist above the rest of us with the authority to determine who lives and how. This legacy is legacy historic colonial violence. This is legacy to historic colonial violence on Indigenous land. Shadow on the land, an excavation and bush burial. This is work that recently was created for and exhibited at the Biennale of Sydney 2020. The work is an excavation of the shadow cast by Captain Cook statue in Hyde Park. Following the tracing and transfer of the shadow to the site, it's a careful excavation that retains the shadow's shape and reveals what the land holds beneath the surface. The Cook Monument shadow is an embodiment of the shadow of greed, pollution, destruction, cast on land by corporate capitalist colonization and settlement. By creating a hole large enough to bury the statue, the work's excavation, along with its title, suggests the burial of the Cook Monument itself, along with the burial of destructive governance and treatment of Indigenous land, Indigenous people, Indigenous knowledge. Throughout the dig, small flags are placed, marking evidence of Indigenous presence preceding Cook's arrival. The excavation of the colonial shadow by Indigenous artists using the scientific practice of archaeology as an art medium turns a practice that originates with colonizers' belief in white supremacy to delivering a layered critique and call for change. The resulting earthwork presents an opportunity to prepare for the burial on land designated as a prison by coloners of the Cook Monument itself, along with the burial of governance and legislation casting shadows of erasure, pollution, and violence against Indigenous lives and knowledge. This particular piece came at a timely, I guess I couldn't have timed the conversation or planned to time it as well as it aligned with what's going on in these colonial governments and in these countries. You know, we share a lot of Indigenous cultures, especially share a lot of common settler and colonial struggles that are placed upon us and in these forms of nation building. So the Hyde Park Cook Monument was a project that I really wanted to speak to after visiting Australia a few times and learning that they would be celebrating the 250th anniversary of Cook's arrival. This monument is often, the statue is often spoken of as a discovery monument. And this image was taken recently, and it's, to me, very telling to show which to show who the government protects or what they protect and why. So of course, this is an image similar to images that maybe we've seen in New York in front of the American Museum of Natural History with the, I believe it's a Roosevelt statue, which is coming down, thankfully. And barriers are also an important aspect and part of this project, particularly because we were seeing police use these barriers to separate community from accessing these statues or these monuments. And what these statues often represent, a lot of times it's not so much about the public caring about protecting the object as it is about protecting what that object represents to certain communities. Alongside that work, Shadow on the Land, and excavation and bush burial, I want to note that a bush burial in the title was a reference to a colonial painting that I saw while I was visiting Australia. It's a Frederick McCubbin painting, a fabricated and romanticized scene depicting the first burial of a white settler on Aboriginal land in Australia. And I think that in the history of colonial violence, the injection of settler bodies into these narratives is oftentimes a common part of the process of genocide. It's also the process of deciding or selecting which narratives, which histories uphold an aspect of retelling, an aspect of history is really common. So, you know, history is weaponized. The process of archaeology is as well, oftentimes. All of our objects from our communities, not only have we been removed from our land, not only have our children been removed from families oftentimes, not only has our language been removed from our mouths, but our objects of power still sit in these institutions. They're still on exhibit. They're still, there's, as an indigenous maker and indigenous artist, we learn some of the first things we learned through navigating access to our culture is to navigate through institutional space, to navigate through those frameworks. To some of the first things we learn to do if we want to access some of our historical objects is that we are not allowed to actually touch them because there's been arsenic painted on them to preserve them at some period, possibly. And this piece is titled Architecture of Return Escape, Metropolitan Museum of Art. The first in a series of hide paintings for guiding the escape of indigenous remains and indigenous objects in non-indigenous institutions to return to their home communities. Architecture of Return Escape, Metropolitan Museum of Art is a mapped escape plan for objects held in the Met in New York City. The work is a plan for wayfinding during decolonization, requiring return, building new structures for good ways of being. Of the few objects held in display cases, many more, including human remains and ceremonial objects not intended for public view, are held in the museum's archives. Atu, inside a closed container. This is a red cedar piece. Atu, inside a closed container, is a weathered bentwood box with formline design. Attached to the box face is a carved wooden safe handle, a carved combination dial bearing the number 1 and fractions counting down to 0 instead of numbers counting up by 10. Inside the box is an unaltered sea otter hide with the pattern outlines drawn on the skin side. The weathered box represents a container for our culture, knowledge and customs that they have weathered time and continue to be carried forward, transformed into a kind of safe. The work insists on the value of cultural knowledge and practice. The sculpture bears the impulse to protect what is valuable and threatened through a colonial understanding of wealth as something as restricted to a few. The combination lock and safe handle are clearly new additions of the unweathered wood and represent the requirement of blood quantum as a barrier to access. The fractions, the access that I speak to and the blood quantum is a reference to fractions on the combination dial point to the barring of descendants from accessing ancestral knowledge, cultural practices, and rights based on fraction of certified Indian blood. So that it's a reference to the legality of whether or not we're allowed to pass on cultural customs and traditions. Legislation around the sale of otter fur, like blood quantum, revolves around perceived wholeness. You have to be of specified blood quantum to legally work with sea otter, which is a cultural tradition and knowledge in our community. And once your perceived blood quantum, or once your blood quantum hits a certain percentage, your children are no longer allowed to access that practice. The reality of blood quantum in our communities is a colonial form of slowly removing us. It's an eraser that will eventually wipe our access to indigenous ancestry legally away from the land. This work's titled The Violence of Blood Quantum, Half Human Animal after James Luna. Self-portrait torn vertically in half, one eye swollen black and blue, reflects multiple layers of violence enacted through religious indoctrination and state enforcement of division between humans and non-human animals, and by further dividing humans from each other. Half-human animal references the dehumanizing language and policies used to justify genocide and violence towards indigenous and non-European people in the Americas. The work's title asserts all humans as a single type of animal, resisting non-indigenous epistemologies that espouse human supremacy and false moral division from non-human life. The work specifically targets blood quantum, a colonial and settler legislated genocide against indigenous communities. The policy of tracking and measuring Indian blood was and continues to be a fundamental tool in removing indigenous people from legal claim to live, farm, hunt, and fish on ancestral lands throughout North America. Simultaneously, African blood was tracked and measured down to a single drop, not to erase the African, but to retain oppressive claims of ownership under colonial and subsequently settler law. The diptych is a record of the artist's act of tearing down his own image. And 2, the internalization of blood quantum legislation by indigenous people and communities causes indigenous people of mixed heritage to tear themselves into pieces daily. The work asserts that belief in and enforcement of the non-indigenous concept of blood quantum slowly erodes and erases connection to indigenous identity and culture, and perpetuates violence while damaging the rights and responsibilities of people descended from indigenous nations. This work again is after the late great James Luna's half Indian, half Mexican. What have we become? Personal contemporary experience of continuation of attempt to remove cultural practice by institutions, homogenize knowledge and disconnect romanticized iconography in the form and medium of text. So this series is thousands of pages of anthropological text cut and bound into books. This particular base portrait of What Have We Become is text from a 1970s Smithsonian publication that is like many publications, romanticizes our indigenous communities to a period of purity and authenticity, attempting to freeze us in this idea of pre-contact existence that is often a form of it's a period that is heavily romanticized and is often used as some form of measurement of authenticity. See, I'm going to play you guys a video clip here. I think it's next. Okay. Who we are. Anthropological catalogs of removal, foundations to institution. Dispossession lays groundwork for appropriation. Collection as a means of control and genocide. We belong to these objects. We have memory collectively stored in them. So this video loop is probably 35,000 still images, which was a project the Burke Museum in Seattle put together. These are all cultural Northwest Coast objects and ceremonial objects placed are photographed in institutions across the world. Obviously, some of the objects that weren't not included in this that would be amongst the collection is, our human remains that some of these museums still hold. Indian children's bracelets. Tourists and collectors overlook our history while consuming iconography. To see only the metal and design on these bracelets while ignoring historical information is selective amnesia. These bracelets don't allow for our history to be ignored, honoring the resilience of survivors and generations affected by the weight of wearing these. Three separate sets of these children's bracelets exist and must remain in separate institutions. These bracelets are representations of the children's bracelets that were used to remove children from families or to punish children in boarding schools. Native America beadwork, rape whistle pendant. Purpose is both to call attention to the fact that violence against Indigenous women is higher than any other group, drawing the attention to our responsibility to respect and protect the women in our communities. The work we make for ourselves is inherently different than the work we make for sale to outside communities. It reflects the difference of our realities. Your inane perspective. Ha-ani. Our land is our life is the disregard for Indigenous knowledge by settler societies of the past. This photo is a photo taken in my community here, and it's capturing a part of the colonial process and violence that still continues, and that's through the language, through place names. So you can see that this creek has been renamed to No Name Creek, even though it clearly has a name. The title aims at the colonial mentality of claiming ownership and erasure of Indigenous culture through renaming. The Tlingit name here translates to river with a little middle finger at the mouth. The sun never shines in it. Indian petroglyphs. These works will last long after we're gone, long after the logos and mascots have meaning, long after the trademarks have any use. This is a version of the Indian petroglyph carved in my community. And then of course there's some urban examples. This is outside of the Vancouver Art Gallery. And there was one in New York City that I created outside of the old Peter Bloom Gallery. I don't know if that's there anymore though. Imaginary Indian, the evolution of culture, objects and museums fetishized, mimicked, and become ghost-like. Attempting to disappear the Indigenous into the European, once utilitarian, once supernatural, once connected to community, now extracted and put on display as trophies. This series was also exploring the different forms of consumption of our community, of our culture, of our language, of our visual language, of our identity. This piece particularly was a panel that I purchased from a native gallery. The native gallery selling Indigenous art to tourists in our communities, except this panel was carved by a non-native artist. So asking the question of what are challenging the ideas of what is native art or what can be. It's definitely not a fashion. It's definitely not a style. It's definitely not an aesthetic. Yet the piece that I created in the commentary is inherently indigenous. So Raven and the First Immigrant, installed at the Museum of Anthropology. Chainsaw carved rough contrast to Bill Reed's work inside the museum. Raven and the First Man. An indigenous creation story. This is a nation creation story, cut quickly by the use of chainsaw, mimicry of form, abandoning the knowledge that informs the form. Natural resource and space invaders. Juxtaposition of natural resources and the ways in which the land is treated by indigenous and settler ways of life. Space invaders stand in for so-called pioneers and pilgrims and prospectors, illustrations of indigenous perspective. Inert, the inability to move. The wolf in this work, like indigenous people, has been damaged by colonization of the land and continues to move despite efforts to change the living in trophies. Felted wolves cannot bite. So this work was also a representation of the attempt to contain. Oftentimes indigenous culture is battling ideas of containment, literally, physically, through our access to resource, containment through our access to move across land, containment through the ability to survive and subsist on the land. So the back half of this represents that colonial containment. Containment also happens in our communities through knowledge, through retelling of our language or our histories, and through whose perspective is that. Get comfortable. Assertion of presence, resilience, opposition to cultural amnesia regarding land, violence, and complacency. The altered sign focuses the viewer on land, a reminder that land and people and indigenous, that the land and the people indigenous to it remain connected regardless of the discomfort this may cause nations and communities built on colonial legacies of attempted genocide. The work raises questions about comfort, pointing to the lack of comfort afforded to indigenous communities during the invasion of the Americas by colonial state and during the subsequent permanent settlement of the land. Let's play a little part of this, part 2 of this work. So Suhedi Shugaktitan translates to "we'll again open this container of wisdom that's been left in our care." The 2-part video piece is a celebration of culture and the necessity of contribution over consumption. Song, dance, and language as intersecting streams to carry cultural continuum. The reference of a container that's been left in our care, to me, is the visual aspect of this work is a reminder to those that romanticize. It's a reminder to those that mimic. It's a reminder to those that continually try to contain or take or consume our community, that we are always the ones with sovereign, creative, cultural power and representation of how we engage with the world, with how we choose or need to operate in order to survive, in order to thrive. Ism, superimpose Tlingit iconography over religious iconography used by missionaries attempting to destroy our culture. Missionaries functioned as a wedge used to split apart indigenous communities during colonization and settlement, forcibly replacing indigenous creation stories, knowledge and connection of spirituality and bodily experience with stories of suffering as a deserved result of evil ways of living. The American dream is a lie and well. The American dream is lie and well exposes the foundation of a dream built on genocide, theft, slavery, deceit, and erroneous supremacy. The dream cuts cultures with lies in the form of constructed borders, xenophobia, white supremacy, and nationalism. This work speaks to the continued violence celebrated through trophy and American excess, gold teeth and bullet claws, reminders of the quest for wealth that drove colonization and manifest destiny, and the continued use of military aggression by the United States throughout the world. Operation Geronimo, reflection of the ways consumer culture attempts to inhabit our histories. Shallow cultural voyeurism is part of consumption of culture. The print Operation Geronimo engages the American government's use of force and violent conflict since its infancy to subjugate the rights of indigenous, Black, and brown bodies and communities in the Americas and around the world, simultaneously calling out the American public's eagerness to claim and inhabit indigenous spaces. The title references the United States' continued practice of naming military equipment after indigenous nations and using Geronimo as a name for Osama bin Laden and the military action resulting in his death. Here, Operation Geronimo superimposes an American family taken from a real estate advertisement in the space of Geronimo's face. The last indigenous leader to fight the US invasion of North America is positioned as an amusement park cutout for American families shopping for homes to peer through. A reminder to the viewer that contemporary real estate market is a continuation of land theft, the longest running military operation in US history, transferred from the military to the civilian population to continue. I think it goes like this. Reflects decimation of indigenous knowledge and technology by colonization, aggressive mining of land and culture to create capital denied sovereignty of indigenous culture. We have fracturing communities and knowledge and continue to create. The title recognizes our effort to arrange the pieces and to work with what we have. continuation, and sovereign resilience. White Carver. This work is an ongoing installation performance, and I believe it started in 2012 or 11, around there. White Carver's story is simple. White Carver visited Pacific Northwest on a cruise ship in the 60s, where he fell in love with Tlingit art. Upon his return home, he purchased several books on Tlingit culture and studied ceremonial objects and forms closely. Eventually, White Carver took some classes and purchased some knives. Today, White Carver demonstrates, sells, and creates native art. In this performance installation, White Carver is attempting to recreate a yellow cedar sculpture of a male masturbation tool titled, "I Love Your Culture." This is a piece that I carved out of red cedar with my indigenous hands. Portraits of past White Carvers hang in his studio, acknowledging his legacy. In taking on the role of White Carver, the White Carver has no other identification or name. He's only known for his role as White Carver. Ruminations, relationships to culture through glass, through lens, through display case, through institution. Ha'ani, our land, is what this work translates to. It's a celebration of subsistence and the ways we continue to live with and because of what the land provides. Indigenous resistance to environmental destruction is not terrorism. I dreamt I could fly, ceramic arrows as symbols for restrictions on indigenous culture and technology by colonial rules of engagement. Rendered fragile and useless, porcelain arrows will shatter on contact. They cannot feed or defend a family or community. We associate flight with freedom, freedom of motion to travel beyond our current limitations. This dream of flight is a dream of sovereignty for indigenous people. We dreamt deaf. So caught up in our own desires and dreams, we've been deaf to our effect on the land and our relatives. A taxidermy polar bear shot in the 70s in Shishmaref by a white sport hunter. The village is now being swallowed by a rising sea. The bear melts into trophy form. We dreamt death is half animal, half rug, fixed in the struggle to survive in an unsustainable condition. With his title, we are all implicated in participating in the anthropocentric industrial dream that renders us deaf to our impact on all of our relatives, human and non-human. Speaking to colonizers and the colonized, to generations past and future, to humans as an animal forgetful of our place in the world. The work speaks of losing sight and sound of what is done to us and by us, of how we are living, what is being lost through our taking. The polar bear is an iconic symbol of struggle for survival of animals and cultures who have been decimated through colonial corporate enterprises focused on extraction from land and the development of capital without care for the consequence. Uhan, we. Uhan means we in Tlingit language. Reclamation of land and space through indigenous knowledge, through language. So in this work, the box is a Tlingit red corner storage box. It's an older piece that was passed down to me through family. And inside of the box is a pirate radio station, wired up and playing. So it's broadcasting Tlingit language lessons, and the reference of reclamation of space is also literal because of the range that this antenna has, and because of the use of broadcasting our language and our knowledge as a process of reclamation. Things are looking native, natives looking wider. In the wake of efforts of settler culture to erase native people, two iconic images are connected to evidence the desire of contemporary settler culture to claim us in the future. The Curtis legacy. Edward Curtis traveled the Western US photographing indigenous people, not as they were living contemporary lives at the time. He dressed them in clothing and regalia, often not their own culture, and created images that reinforced the active attempt to vanish the Indian and indigenous ways of life. A non-indigenous woman wears an Indonesian-made copy of a Tlingit mask in this series. Fetish and desire for indigenous culture is aligned with fetish and desire for the female body. Sige Ka'awu Ghost, this series is titled. Made by non-native ceramic artists, these masks are based on Indonesian copies of Tlingit masks covered with blue deathware patterns, removing them 3 times from the origination of Tlingit culture. Far removed, they are ghosts of memories contained in our cultural objects, a response to the ways our cultural objects have been stolen, mined, copied for consumption. Kill the Indian, save the man. Kill the Indian, save the man was the official policy of the US government and church for generations. This was a justification for attempting to destroy our language, and the outlawing of our religious and cultural practices, forced assimilation. This work mirrors this process by carving into Indonesian copies of Tlingit masks until nothing but splintered wood chips remain. Rearranging pieces reflects the ways we have to rearrange ourselves and our communities while destroying a false impersonation of who we are. How are we doing on time? That's what I really want to know.
I think we're doing okay. You can close when you're ready. Maybe in a minute or so we can move into.
Okay, I'll go keep going through a few more of these works here. Imaginary Indian Totem. These are familiar faces, and let them enter dancing and showing their faces. This work was enlarged and on the Whitney Museum for the last Whitney Biennial. This work is a reference to memory, memory that I call on memory of process. You know, we have such a deep connection to place here, and I feel like there's this internalized joy of going through and sharing and doing cultural processes of simple things like maybe filleting salmon or skinning deer, or doing these simple forms that I believe are deeply embedded in our connection to existence and place. And those through that process, there's a kind of a unexplainable joy that is felt, and you can't really quite focus it. You can't take it. You can't really share it. You just let it flow through you. And these are attempts at visualizing that through process. So. White Noise, American Prayer Rug, another piece that was in the last Whitney Biennial. White noise refers to steady droning tones used to mask or obliterate unwanted sounds, an active disassociation occurring when a signal is gone or lost. titled "For the Sources of American Political Power in the Media Have Produced Constant Noise in Support of Xenophobia." The work points to whiteness as a construct used throughout the world to obliterate voices and rights of cultures regardless of complexion, calling attention to white noise as a source of increasing intolerance and hate in the United States as politicians, media, and citizens attempt to mask and obliterate the reality of America's genocidal past and racist present. The white noise referenced is produced by a kind of whiteness based on more than complexion. This white noise is based on capital, blind belief and faith in itself, and fear of everything outside the lines it's used to enforce, inclusion or exclusion. The American prayer rug is hung on a wall in place of a flat screen television, as the image is accompanying the droning sound we use to distract us from our own suffering, from love, from land, from water, from connection. There is no space for prayer, only noise.